Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Really pleased to welcome you along today. And we are about to do a joint webinar, which is being brought to you by both the Federation of Master Builders and CIAT, the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists. And the reason we're working together on this is that the issue that we're talking about today is very relevant to both sets of members of both organisations. We're talking about the Building Safety Act, and in particular the roles of principal designers and principal contractors and how those two roles interact. And we're hoping to unpick all of that a little bit today and come up with some ideas and solutions, practical ways that both roles can work together for a successful project. So I'll go through a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We've got with us today Sarah May from CIAT, who's going to talk about the legislation and the background to all of this. We've also got Nathan Oliver from his company Icon Design, I think. I may have got that wrong.
Iconographic.
Iconographic design, thank you. And Nathan's going to talk about how this affects him as a from the principal designer perspective. And we've also got our member Peter Atkins here of AS Homes, who's going to be talking about the principal contractors perspective. And just a reminder that we're talking today about smaller scale projects. We're not talking about the high risk buildings or complex projects, which don't tend to be what our members are typically working on. My name, by the way, is Hayley Lorimer. I'm Director of Membership at the FMB. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. So this webinar should take about 45 minutes, maybe an hour if we get a lot of questions and discussions at the end. If you do have a question or a comment to make, if you hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to see a Q&A box or a chat box. You can use either of those to type your questions and comments and ideas in there so that the panel can address those all together at the end of the webinar. After the session, we will be sending out a follow-up email, which will have a link to the recording of this, should you want to watch the whole thing again. It'll also have any resources that we refer to during the webinar, links to various websites, etc., if we refer to those. So that means you don't have to note everything down as we go through the content of the webinar. So I'll now hand over, without further ado, to Sarah to go through the legislative background to all of this. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Hayley. Let me just share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that. Is that, yeah? Okay, so looking at the screen then, we can see here that in terms of the legislation which came into effect in October 2023, the Building Safety Act deemed that duty holders needed to be identified, and therefore within the building regulations amendments of 2023, the principal designer for building regulations and the principal contractor for building regulations was introduced. Basically, and I'm trying to keep this kind of like as basic as possible and high level as possible for everybody to kind of like keep a track of. But in this diagram here, you can kind of see how the client relates with the principal designer for building regs, which is the blue lozenge boxes at the top. And then you can see how they relate to the CDM principal designer, principal contractor. The main point is that the principal designer for building regulations is distinctly different from the CDM principal designer. So that's why we're kind of concentrating today on the building regulations side of it, and compliance and competence. And as you can see from this diagram, the principal designer should be appointed in writing. They should coordinate with the design team. That's if it's a project that is kind of the size that you might have more than one designer, that kind of thing. And that the principal designer for the building regulations can take on the CDM principal designer role as well. And obviously you can see those two arrows there that liaise and share compliance between the principal designer and the principal contractor, which is key for this particular webinar. I'm just going to turn the slide, hopefully. There we go. So this is much more detail. So project governance roles. So we have a lead designer, principal designer, and the lead designer is not as legislative role. It's more the guidance around it, because you may find yourself being a lead designer and you may employ a principal designer. And as you can see from there, the core purposes of each one of those and how they are distinctly different from the CDM principal designer, which is the Construction Design Management Regulations 2015. There's always been some confusion between the two. So today we're kind of trying to help you understand the difference between the two, the very clear difference. One is around the building regulations. So they're only appointed at the building regulations design stage. They don't have to be appointed before that, because let's say, for instance, you bought a plot that had got planning permission. That particular designer is then out of the picture. So you're looking at the building regs, that kind of thing. So that's why it's the building regs principal designer. The CDM principal designer obviously comes in much before that, because then they would make sure that the site is safe, and it's pre-construction health and safety basically, isn't it? So it's the health and safety about the project itself. So these slides are in the presentation, so I won't dwell on them too much. And then we've kind of got the building regulations and the CDM roles. We've got a little bit more details here. So statutory duty holder is the principal designer for building regs and also for CDM. Confusing to most people, but the building regs principal designer plans, manages and monitors design work, so that if built, the work complies with all relevant requirements. The principal contractor plans, manages, monitors building work so that it complies with all the relevant requirements. So basically, if there's more than one contractor, or it's reasonably foreseeable that there's more than one contractor, that's when the PD is appointed, etc. And the key distinctions between them. Oops, sorry. I thought we were going to go on to that then. So we've got so you can actually see it because that was quite small, I suppose. So yeah, so coordinates designers and design decisions for the building regulations compliance. The liaison, which is what we're going to come on to very soon, between the client and the principal contractor and the principal designer, is of paramount importance as far as CI80 is concerned, to make sure that the design work is built in accordance with the approved design itself that's been through building control, and that the client is fully aware of their duties as well. So in terms of CDM, I won't go through that because that's just going to confuse things. But the key distinction between them two, PD building regs, is about the building regulations compliance. The principal designer may also hold the CDM principal designer role if they're competent to do so and properly appointed. So the properly appointed part is very important. But the CDM designer does not automatically satisfy the principal designer role. That's really key as well, because they have to be a designer on the project. The principal designer has to be the designer on the project, especially for a small project. So it must be that the client, when they appoint, they must appoint in writing. They must make sure that they've agreed in writing as well, if we're talking about domestic clients or even commercial clients for that matter, if you would be working for a developer, for instance, that kind of thing. They should be appointed, the principal designer should be appointed before the construction starts, at least. And for the actual domestic project, the client duties normally sit with the principal contractor, unless it's agreed in writing with the building regulations principal designer that they will take them on. So that's one of the key things about a domestic client, I think. So a domestic client is that person that you're doing work for them on their own house where they are going to live. So that's the key thing, I think, that we needed to make sure of, especially here. And that is basically all of my slides. So just to backtrack again, we are concentrating on the domestic client perspective, and Nathan will go on to that in a bit more detail. And in terms of the building regulations PD role, they automatically take on the designer automatically takes on the PD role if nobody is appointed. if they are still involved in the project. If they're not involved in the project, the principal contractor will, obviously, because it's the client. So I hope that is clear.
Sarah. Thank you. I did say we'd save all the questions till the end, but there's one that's specifically about what your content that you were just talking about, which I'd like to ask you now, which is a question from Mike, who's saying that if only a single contractor is appointed, in such a case, is there no requirement for a principal designer? Does this apply where subcontractors are present? I'm not
Okay.
sure I
I
understand.
think what he means is, because if it's a domestic client, and I'm assuming it's a domestic client, Mike, then the duties automatically transfer. The client duties for appointing people automatically transfers to the contractor. However, the contractor is then the principal designer as well if they haven't appointed a principal designer. So they have to make sure that they are competent to be that. Otherwise, they need to appoint a principal designer, because obviously they've taken on the client's duties. So the contractor would need to appoint a principal designer. So it's like a client buying a piece of land and they employ a builder, and then they need a principal designer then to do the building regulations, etc.
God, now we've got another question here on the same subject. We're going to go down a whole regulations rabbit hole. I think we might need to save these other questions till the end, otherwise we're going to run out of time. But
all I would say to Ryan is that was specifically domestic clients, and we'll do the other bit later.
Right, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll hand over to Nathan now.
Great, thank you. I'll try and share my screen. Hopefully that works. Is that coming through?
It's about to. I think there it is. Yes, got it now.
Yeah, okay, great. That's a little header. So yeah, thanks for inviting me along. Just have a quick, well, I'll say a chat discussion about how to apply the regulations to small projects. So if I click, that's a small project. What we'll talk about: practical applications, common scenarios, how to engage with architectural technologists, architects, and other professionals, how coordination should take place between duty holders for late design changes, what about the principal designer's fees, suggested tools to help you, and I'll do a little live case study as well. I think I need to add as well, I'm talking about my interpretation of the regulations. I'm sure there's different people have different interpretations, so hopefully we're all on a similar page. But that's what I'm sharing with my interpretation. I've read the regulations quite a few times now, so hopefully what I talk about is accurate. But we'll move on, hopefully. That same project. So, as Sarah's already pointed out, I think this talk is about small-scale buildings, not high-risk buildings, aimed at domestic, but could also be commercial to a certain degree, based on traditional procurement, design completed before construction, unless a contractor design portions are used, not based on design and build or partnering, procurement, other contractor engagement. I haven't really talked about the CDM 2015 duties, but we can talk about that if there's any overlap, any questions, I suppose. I'm primarily focusing on the building regulation duties. I have to admit, I appreciate that what I'm going to talk about is quite wordy and it's quite legislative. It's probably not the most exciting topic, but so I've chucked a few pictures in there, trying to make it a bit more engaging. But move on. So practical applications and common scenarios. So there's a late design change on site during construction, say by the contractor or subcontractor, might have good intentions, want to make something cheaper or quicker, or notice something doesn't work. As a principal designer, you need to be careful though. So who's going to take design responsibility for that change? Who will benefit from the design change? If it's just about making life easier for the principal contractor and the team, but there's no cost or time benefits for the client, is it worth it? I can't answer that necessarily. There's also other implications to think through. If the principal contractor changes something on site without checking with the principal designer first and getting their approval, the principal contractor is essentially taking on the design liability and responsibility for this change, unless checked and approved by the principal designer and possibly building control. I think that's really important to understand. So, as I said a moment ago, that if the principal contractor or subcontractors are having good ideas about making changes for good reasons, that's great. So I think there should be a collaboration, very much a of people working together as a team, but I think you need to go through a process to make sure it's checked and coordinated to make sure there's no other knock-on effects that could affect other things that may not have been thought about. So I think I'll just outline a bit later on some of a way of doing that, I suppose. I suppose the drawings and specifications should also be updated accordingly as they're contract documents. A good principal designer will usually have designed and specified something for a good reason. So if it's got to change, there's got to be a good reason to change it, and it's got to be performing as intended. Change the design at a late stage may mean a non-compliant design is being built. There's a lot of common sense needs to be applied. Small insignificant changes shouldn't need to be checked, coordinated, and approved. I think my interpretation is mainly to do larger changes that affect structure, groundworks, fire safety, thermal performance, damp proofing, that sort of stuff, I suppose. Does the principal designer need to be involved during the construction phase of a project? Is this a requirement under the legislation? I hear a lot of people say that they think it is. Personally, I'm not so sure. I suppose a lot of the principal designers are only appointed up until stage 3 or stage 4 or under REBA work stages, so they may not be involved on site. As far as I can tell from reading the regulations, there's no legislative requirement for a principal designer to be involved on site. Does it make sense? I think it does. It'd be a sensible approach, but not all clients want to pay for that. That's totally understandable, I think. So how do you engage with architectural technologists and other professionals? Common sense, nothing new, good communication, keep talking to each other. I think start off with a telephone call to begin with. That'd be a good starting point. Have a chat over the phone. And there's some building going on there. And then ensure any agreements and decisions made are followed up with emails in writing. File can easily retrieved for future reference. Don't start building work if it's different to the approved design and drawings, and then contact the principal designer. Might be a bit late by then. Any doubt or questions, speak to the principal designer first, and then start building things. How coordination should take place between the duty holders. So again, have a chat. Again, follow up changes in writing, involve the client in these conversations, state the reasons. I think the client needs to be made aware that something's going to change and what impact that might have on performance, time, money. I think you need to allow a reasonable time frame. We're all busy, I like to think. So I suggest at least 2 to 3 weeks, maybe more. Principal designer, and other designers check the proposals. This may involve updating the drawings and drafts and checking the clashes elsewhere not thought of. Principal designer then reports back to the principal contractor and the client on the implications of the changes and the potential knock-on effects, short and long-term effects. Principal designer and or other designers then confirm they're happy with the design change and the change doesn't affect other parts of the design and the construction too much. That's great. That's the ideal situation, I suppose. Might not always be able to happen. So then the drawing specifications can be updated to reflect design changes as the final set and reissued, or the principal designer and all other designers are not satisfied with the design change, don't want to update the drawings and specification at the moment. So then if that's the case, a modified change can be agreed. So the overall change is sort of agreed, but maybe tweaked a bit amongst the team. Then a final change can be agreed and the drawing specification can then be updated. Or the drawings and spec not updated. The principal contractor has a choice. Change as they originally suggested, but they take on the design risk. Or don't change and leave the drawings and specification as originally shown. So don't take on board the change they thought about. What about the principal designer's fees? So as I said before, if principal designers are only appointed up to REBA stage 4, for example, planning and building regs, and there needs to be involved on site past their fee agreement, what happens? I think if design changes are proposed during stage 5 construction on site, I think it should be paid. You might need to visit site to review changes, update drawings, report back, as I talked about a moment ago. This could easily take up several hours, half a day's work, maybe more. What if the design doesn't actually comply? Who pays for their time? Client, principal contractor, possibly the client, but it depends. I think it's worth dwelling on what part of the design doesn't comply. So if the principal contractor has flagged up some design work that doesn't comply and needs to be updated so it complies, I don't think the principal designer should be paid for that, or designer should be paid for that, so it should have complied in the first place. I think it's reasonable to take it on the chin and correct it and then move on, I think. I think, though, as a principal designer, you should have always allowed for this in your original quote or fee proposal. If you don't have this already covered, I suggest you introduce it. So you need to make an allowance for any site works past your original appointment if it goes past stage 4 and you're only employed up to stage 4. You need to be mindful of this as suggesting late design changes as well as a contractor or principal contractor. If you want some late design changes, there may be a knock-on effect on fees that the client might have to pay. So just be mindful of that, I think. That's drawing. So there's some tools that I think can help you or us document improve compliance. This is based on the processes that I use. I think they work. They might be a bit different, or there might be different ways of doing it that achieve the same result, and that's fine. So I think you need to include for construction involvement in your quote and appointment documents. I generally allow a time charge and hourly rate. So if I'm employed for up to stage 4 in my quote document, I'll say any site works, I charge you X amount of per hour. If you need a few hours here and there, that's what the cost will be. And some clients are happy with that. Adopt SOPs, standards and operating procedures, create templates that can be reused, create checklists that flag up key actions and dates when they're required. Before design commences, send a specific letter to clients, notifying them of their duties, get confirmation they understand. So I think there's a template example of a letter that I will send to all my customers or clients before I start design work. And this is based on templates that the CIAT and Ariba have produced. So I think you need to send that to your customer, client, get them to confirm that they understand it, and then you can start design work. I think that's a must. The thing is, though, when your input ends, which could be before the end of Ariba stage 5, you also need to send the client a building regulations compliance statement that summarises the arrangements you put in place to fulfil your duties. I'm not sure if a lot of people have read this bit of the regulations. Are they doing it? I don't know. But I suppose it does say there, the principal designer must, when the principal designer's appointment ends, no later than 28 days after the end of the appointment, give to the client a document explaining the arrangements it put in place to fulfill the duties under paragraphs 1 to 3. I don't think that's just a signature in a bit of paper. I think it's actually a bit more of a structured document that lays out how you complied with each part of the building regulations. So I've created an internal template based on all the approved documents, and I said this is what I've done to achieve compliance, and it just summarizes it in a very basic form. I've also made a note there what design changes during the construction phase, and I've also put in a few notes saying that, if I'm not involved on the site, I can't confirm that the construction has been built as the design. So I think you need to have that sort of caveat in there as well if you're a designer. Drawing. So this is quickly go through a live case study. How am I doing for time? Am I doing okay for time?
Yeah, you're fine, Nathan.
Okay, great.
Carry on.
So I think some of the drawings we've seen so far, that's actually for a project that we'll talk about now. It says low carbon timber framed single story domestic extension, vertical timber cladding. It's a self build. So this is slightly unusual that the client is also the principal contractor. The client is physically building it himself or most of it. So the client stroke principal contractor has also put forward a few design changes. So design change 1, I'm going to outline there's some timber floor beams not quickly available in the size specified. So the client principal contractor suggested using 2 small timber beams bolted together to provide adequate strength. Checked to me as principal designer and also the structural engineer as a designer and builder control. This is easily checked and agreed, no short or long-term issues or clashes, and that's this fairly straightforward way of going through a design process change, I suppose, low impact. I think it's one of these beams, these floor beams. One of them is quite deep, I think, is a flitch beam, so I need to change it. But yeah, fairly minor change. Then design change 2, the timber cladding is close to a boundary under Part B. It is a minimum reaction to fire Euro class BS1DO. I sourced and specified cladding from a manufacturer or supplier called Russwood, and it's treated with burn block and factory applied, pre-treated, impregnated fire retardant system. It's tested and certified. I think it's permanent. If I zoom in, no, I can't. So it's on this boundary here. See a thick blue line. That's the boundary because the cladding's close to this boundary here. So that's that section there that needs to be fire treated cladding. Yeah, the Russell cladding system was a permanent system, lasted the life of the building, did not need any reapplication. It's a fit and forget solution. As you might expect, it's quite expensive. The client principal contractor wanted to change to a cheaper untreated cladding system and then use a site applied fire retardant clear coating instead, which is fine in principle. It's going to comply and tick the box. Consult with building control also. Building control now require a supply certificate and the code needs to be reapplied every 4 years. I wasn't actually that comfortable changing that as part of design, and I decided not to accept that design responsibility for that change. So the drawing specification weren't updated, and I've not taken responsibility for that. So it's up to the client contractor to take design responsibility for that, and they've got to keep reapplying it every 4 years. What happens though if someone moves out and he moves out, somebody else lives there? Are they going to keep reapplying it? Are they actually going to know about it? I hope so. So the client principal contractor agreed a way forward with building control that appears to be acceptable without me updating the drawings and specification. I'll be noticing this in the end of project compliance checklist that I showed you just a moment ago. I suppose nearly the end now, my little chat. So some of the thoughts. I think also as a designer, you need to keep checking you're competent, especially if the project scope changes. And a good principal designer shouldn't be trying to enforce anything on anyone. Should be working together as a collaborative team and trying to be helpful, trying to get things delivered, built properly, that comply with the regulations and keep everyone safe. Hope this provides you with a better understanding of the legislation, how it could affect you and the implications and some processes that I might want to follow. And also there's one I'm here actually, I don't know if you can see this, but I've got a book. You can't see it. I don't think it's called The Principal Designer's Guide published by Reba. That's quite a good book that I've been reading through. I recommend that as well. I think any questions, I think we said we'd put that in the chat. So I'm not been checking that. So any questions, hopefully you can deal with those in a short while. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. I can see Sarah's been responding to one or two of the detailed questions about the regulation in the chat, which I'm very relieved about, Sarah, I have to say. That's great. Thank you for doing that. And thanks, Nathan, for that. Just on that point about sending a letter to clients to let them know about their responsibilities under the Building Safety Act, just to let FMB members know who are listening, FMB has produced a similar template for them to use to help inform their clients about their responsibilities, which we will send out with the copy of the slides and the webinar recording after the session. So thanks, Nathan. Now, Peter, are you happy to come in with some comments now from a principal contractor perspective on all of this?
Yeah, thanks, Hayley. I haven't got any slides to be showing anyone, so don't anyone worry about that. But I agree wholeheartedly with what Nathan and Sarah both went through there. So it's quite helpful to see that from different sides of the industry, we're all kind of saying the same thing. From a principal contractor side of things, as with everyone else, we became aware of this change in legislation a couple of years back. And I found as a principal contractor that I was being forced or asked to take up the role of principal designer at a very early stage, and that was happening. And I also found I was coming under quite a lot of pressure from both architects, but also my clients to be signing off the compliance declaration at the end of it. Often the compliance declarations are linked to payments, final payments. And so there's that added pressure as well. So that's why with Hayley and some others at the FMB that we decided to look into this more and see what guidance we could offer fellow FMB members. Because if I'm going through it, then I've no doubt that a lot of you guys are going through it as well. And there's a real risk and danger that many of us don't know the legislation and feel like we should sign this bit of paper and sign up to be principal designer. Just last week, I had a client saying they expected me to sign up as principal designer. 2 weeks ago, I had an architect say they expected me to sign up as principal designer because they wouldn't be paid to be visiting site throughout the course of the build. So these are real things, and sometimes it can make you doubt yourself. If you're pricing up work, we're keen to get work. Sometimes it can be tough to win work, and sometimes we could find ourselves signing up to something that we really shouldn't be doing, and there's a real risk and danger in that. And I felt both Nathan and Sarah made that really clear that really, if we're not competent designers, and some of us may well be design and build contractors, I'm not. I'm definitely not qualified to be designing anything. I have a good understanding of how things work and how things go together, but I'm no architect. And if we're not competent to do that, then we should definitely put it back to architects and architect technicians as well, and structural engineers. And I think that's more clear than ever. And it's really important that we, as Nathan said, make sure we're in contact with the architect throughout the build. Often we may not have ever dealt with that architect before. It's really worth picking up the phone, talking to them before the start of the contract. Make sure they understand that we will be coming back to them with questions if something practically doesn't work on site. And that is so common for all of us, where we see a drawing and it just doesn't work on site. And so that's normal. That should be a normal thing, that we go back to architects and get them to guide us in how something should be built. Our job is definitely to make sure we build it right and it complies with building regulations. That's where our responsibility lies. So for me, whenever I'm having to have that difficult conversation with an architect, I'm just making it clear to them that what they're being asked to sign for is that their drawings, when they submit to building control, are compliant with the building regulations. And it's my job to make sure that they're built to the building regulations. Yeah, that's it really.
Thank you, Peter. So just to open this up to the whole of the panel, anybody can jump in and answer this question, which I've now lost off my screen. Somebody asked us, when does the building regulations principal designer appointment officially come to an end, is the question in the box there. Does anybody want to pick up on that?
I can pick up on it from the perspective of generally, and then perhaps Nathan can say what his view is on it. So in terms of the principal designer role, and there are a few questions there about who takes on the ownership and all of that kind of thing, and we'll come to that in a minute. But for this particular question, it depends on what the designer has in their scope, basically. If they detail it in their scope that they don't do the PD role, then an alternative principal designer will need to be appointed. Now, whether or not a client is going to employ a designer and a principal designer, I don't know. So in that respect, we have the client templates, the client care letters, the templates, in a position whereby you might be appointed up to the end of planning, which means that you wouldn't be a principal designer. You might be appointed up to the end of the building regulations submission to building control and approval, which is basically the standard kind of scope, if you like, for the building regs PD. However, the building regs PD should be monitoring on site, and they should be making sure that things, are going okay, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean a daily visit to site. That means that a periodic visit at certain points, a bit like a building control officer, because they're ultimately responsible for the design of that building. So there should be no gaps in the evidence, if you like, but it's not that, it's in the design. So there should be no gaps in the detailed design of that building. There should be no questions to ask about how something is going to go together. That's where the principal contractor and the principal designer should have got together, gone through all the drawings to make sure that there was no gaps or anything like that. And then if there was a gap, for instance, because it might be passive house or something like that, then you would contact a specialist, that kind of thing. It's kind of like, if there's something that you don't know, then seek advice from somebody that does know. It's that kind of situation. So it could be that, you know, you're going through the whole of the project. It could be that the principal designer the principal contractor might do some inspections, provided that they videoed it. They have done a report for it for the site inspection, and they have demonstrated to the questions that the principal designer has asked. It doesn't mean that the principal contractor takes on that duty. It just means that it's providing a service to the principal designer, and the principal designer can then put that in the folder ready to, you know, collect with all the collated evidence of what's been built, where it's gone, all of that kind of thing. So the PD should be involved on site at some point, whether it's, you know, however many visits that they've scheduled for and that they've priced for, or it might be on a pay-as-you-go basis. So if there's a site visit that needs to be done and a report that needs to be done for a particular change or something, then it might be that they go in through that. In terms of is that, Peter, I can see that you've got your hand up. You've got something to say for that.
No, I do agree with you, Sarah, but I do think that the realities of the way smaller projects are carried out is very different when it comes to most architects and technologists. They don't visit site, not unless they're being paid for it. And so I do up to one-off new builds, large refurbishment, even down to smaller knock-throughs and things like that, which a lot of the people watching this will be doing, similar to me. And they won't see the architect throughout the project on their job, not unless they are being carried through to stage 5 and being paid for it. And the discussions I've had with building control in various counties, private and local, is that they're very clear that if the architect is submitting building control drawings for building regs, then they take on the role as principal designer. However, if me as a builder then goes and changes something without discussing with the architect, then I, rightly so, will take on that responsibility, and that's on my head. And that's where I think a lot of the builders out there need to be very clear about what they're doing, really. If they're making changes off their own back without talking to someone, then they're going to be principal designer, probably not for the whole thing, but for that element. And that's on their head if they're changing that. And so I think the message I would like to get across to builders like myself is that if you are going to change something, then one, speak to the architect, the designer about it. Secondly, document it and photograph it. Where's the evidence trail in that? It might even be a small thing like changing the type of insulation. I've got one recently where the insulation just isn't readily available. It's just not there. So you know, I did get some new value calculations done by Kingspan, and I could prove that they worked, but I still showed them to the principal designer. I showed them to the building control officer. I shared it with the client. I explained why I was changing the insulation, and it's a lot more work now for builders, but that is just the way it is. And if you want to do something right and cover yourself, that is the process we need to go through.
That's a theme that keeps coming up, isn't it? It's just about, it's not just about what you do, it's about what you've got documented and what you can prove that you've done, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it's about best practice, Hayley.
There's a comment here in the box from Joshua, who's talking about Peter's earlier comments, actually, saying, Peter, this honesty is really good and a fair summary of what happens in industry. As a representative of the building control side of things, we often get resistance when we query or challenge competence, particularly when it's quite obvious. How do the design and contractor professions perceive this role from building control? So interesting questions. Does anybody want to respond to that?
You say that again, Hayley, the question?
Yeah. He's asking about, as a building control representative, if they question or query people's competence, I assume he means to take on those PD and PC roles, they get queried or challenged, they get pushback on that as the building control people on site. So how do designers and contractors perceive the role of building control in all of this? Did you want to comment on that, Nathan?
Yeah, just my opinion. I'm not sure if building control have any legislative control over such things. I think it's more for the client to judge competence. I mean, but by all means, point it out, and especially if it's going to create health and safety issues, long term, and short term for the customers and the clients. Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out. But I think they need to point out to the client maybe and make sure the client can check their competence and be satisfied that they're competent or not, and then if they need to be replaced, I suppose.
That's a difficult issue for a domestic client, though. What yardstick are they judging someone's competence by? Because they don't know anything about the building industry necessarily, do they?
Yeah, true. Yeah, so I suppose they need to take on board the advice from their professional advisors, I suppose, wouldn't they?
Maybe Ryan's come across some real cowboys out there, but it's not anything I've ever had questioned about my level of competency. But maybe that is an issue that he's come across, where he's come across something that's slightly looks suspect, and he's not comfortable with it. Then I guess that's the right thing to do, is to raise their concerns to the homeowner and the client, and make sure that they understand their concerns. That there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think.
I think,
I guess ultimately, if they aren't satisfied that the work complies with the building regulations, they just don't sign it off, do they?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, Sarah.
no, that's okay. I was just going to say that's the point of the duties of the client being moved over to either the PD or the principal designer or the contractor, which you would like to think that they might have found through your website of the list of, FMB members who have demonstrated that they are competent. So I would like to think that people will go that route and find somebody that is competent to be able to identify that, the various trades or whatever are of good quality. Even though, I know that contractors will usually have their own trades, or they will have a selection of people that they know and trust to do the job that they need to do. And that's where I suppose that, if you've decided to give your duties to the principal designer, then they can do that kind of due diligence for you or whatever. That's kind of the point around the domestic client duties moving to either the PD or the PC, so that those kinds of things can be a little less fraught and a little bit less about cowboy builders. I don't really like to mention them anyway. I think Sky News did it quite well this morning, to be honest.
Did they? I missed that. Oh,
yes.
Right. So, comment here from Joshua. He says he's a chartered architect and he does visit site, but he also agrees with Peter that a lot of design professionals are not visiting site on the smaller projects. So that's an interesting perspective from someone who's a designer. David has asked a question: can we as a principal contractor state in quotations that we will not take on the principal designer role? What do people think about that?
So if the principal contractor is not competent to take on the principal designer role, they should be appointing a principal designer. So it's a bit like a developer taking on a site. They're the builder. They've taken on the site and they've got planning for the site. They then would employ, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, they would employ a designer to do the building regs, drawings, and submit to building control for them. They wouldn't do it themselves unless they were competent to do that. And I think, and Peter's already mentioned that. So that's kind of when we were kind of looking at it, and that's where I think some people get confused with the CDM regs, in that the CDM regs principal designer would be appointed earlier on when they're doing the design of the building, because they would mitigate against any risks to safety in terms of balconies and, all of that kind of thing. So it is the building regulations point at which that PD, the PD that we're talking about today, gets appointed and gets into that role of making sure that the drawings are all compliant, making sure that the drawings all make sense and that they can be built. And if they don't understand it, they would get an expert to input into that kind of area that they don't fully understand, a subcontractor or whatever, specialist in, as I said before, passive house, that kind of thing. to make sure that these things actually work before it actually gets to the principal contractor anyway. But then that dialogue and that communication is just really, really important, I think, between any designers and the contractors, if they're all still involved in the project when you get to that point, because that's how the golden thread of evidence, it's golden thread on the HRBs, and to be honest with you, it still should be golden thread on non-HRBs and domestic projects. It's basically the project portfolio. It has everything in it to do with the project. So all of the reports that Peter was talking about, you know, his site reports where he's evidencing what he's put in, he's evidencing how he's done it, you know, all of those kinds of things. So if he's changed insulation, the correspondence between him and the designer and the principal designer and the building control, all of that's in there as well. So there's nothing left to question, basically, between anybody on the project, and it just makes for a compliant, competent project that after the end of the day, if anything goes wrong, there's somewhere to go back to be able to check to see, you know, who's responsible for what defect or whatever. Because let's face it, you've got the defect premises bill, which is 30 years now, isn't it? So, you know, we need to make sure that we've got all of the evidence that we need between us to make sure that a project is safe and compliant.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah, for that comprehensive answer to that. A question here from John Jack in the audience, who has said, thanks all for a very informative CPD session. So that's nice. And he's asked, he has a question regarding how formal appointments for principal designers need to be. If quoting for a project for a commercial client and including fees for the PD role in your fee proposal, does that constitute a formal appointment letter, or is another letter still required where the client responds in writing accepting the fee proposal? Nathan?
I don't think that's comprehensive enough. I think you should be having a set of appointment documents for principal designer duties, especially under commercials. I think under commercial projects, you're a lot more exposed to civil and crown law. I think both parts. I think REBA actually have a principal designer's appointment document suite. I think you'd be advised. I'd advise you to use those set of documents. Use a REBA principal designer appointment documents. It's about a 25-30 page document with all different variations and options to choose from that make sure you're legally covered to the best intentions. I think that'd be my advice.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Anyone else want to add anything to that, or is that okay? I see that Natalia from SEACT has posted a link in the chat box as well with further information on the and resources on the Building Safety Act and the secondary legislation on the SEACT website. We can send that link out with the follow-up email as well. Another question here from Chris, which is similar to the point that Peter made earlier about, it was mentioned that it should be the principal designer's responsibility to check and confirm that the construction work complies with the building regulations, but it's often the case that the principal designer is not employed to undertake site inspections. In this scenario, it's my understanding that it's building control's responsibility to confirm compliance with the regs. Would you agree with this? Do you want to comment on that one, Sarah?
Joshua's put in that he would suggest that building control would determine compliance, not confirm it. It's the principal contractor's role to confirm that he's complied with it. So I think Peter would be able to kind of answer that in terms of, well, he did mention about taking photographs of things as it goes in and all that kind of thing. Do you want to add to that, Peter?
Yeah, so when the architect submits to building reg drawings to them, they will do a plan check and they will check through it for compliance, structural and new values and so on and so forth. So there is a check in place that building control will do. And then, yeah, it's down onto the principal contractor then to make sure, one, they are building to, but if it doesn't work and comply, then they should be flagging that really themselves, because it isn't a foolproof. It isn't, nothing's ever foolproof. All human beings, we do all make mistakes. That's the reality of life. The architect can make mistakes. Building control could miss something. So if we do spot something, we can't just blindly go along with it. We should always flag it if we think it doesn't comply. If it does, then great. If it doesn't, then that's a good catch, isn't it?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Question here from Charles. So, does anyone know if local councils are taking any responsibility when planning is approved to educate domestic clients about their responsibilities under the Building Safety Act, or is that falling on architects and builders to educate them? We still come across domestic clients, he says, who aren't aware of their obligations under CDM. I'm sure you do. Yeah. Do you want to comment on that, Peter?
Yeah, there's nothing out there. There's nothing out there apart from us talking about it now. A few other organisations similar doing similar CPDs. There's nothing up there educating the client, the homeowner, about any of these regulations. It is literally falling down on the architect, the builder, and even sometimes the building control officer. They're having to explain to the client the legislation. I think it's shocking that there isn't enough out there, really. And you're right, when someone goes for planning, that would be the key time, wouldn't it, really, to ping out an email along with their application approval or whatever, to say this is part of your remit, your obligations as a client, to appoint a principal designer, principal contractor. That would make complete sense. But when does anything ever make sense in this?
Yeah, that's actually a really great point that Charles has put there. So next time we speak to MHCLG, I'm going to put that forward to them, that should be something that's happening.
Yeah, I think there is a consultation group that the government or the building safety regulator set up about raising awareness amongst clients. But as far as I know, they started with looking at the clients who are in control of high-risk buildings and complex projects, not the domestic clients, because that's always the most difficult sector to reach, isn't it? But that's a good idea around the planning process.
It's a basic template, isn't it? It's a basic email.
I should add in there. Yeah, so I think in most planning approval letters, they do have a few pointers at the end. Like despite plan permission, you need to comply with building regulations. We suggest you speak to our building control department to get building regulation compliance. Also part of all acts and all this sort of stuff. So you need to add a bit more clarification there, I think, to make it really obvious.
Yeah.
Everyone okay to answer a couple more questions? We're just about coming up to the hour mark, but there's still some questions in the box, so I'll fire those at you if that's okay. Dan has asked whether SEAT currently have standard appointment templates for principal designer role that can be used.
Yes, if Dan is a member, he can access them through my CIAT.
Right.
And Jack's just put it in there.
Okay. Frank asked a question earlier about the building regulations principal designer needing to be a designer with control over the design work, and whether outsourcing the PD role to somebody other than the lead designer fulfills this. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'm hoping that someone else does.
Who was that? Sorry?
That was Frank.
Frank.
I'm not sure for building regulations, you can't, as a lead designer, outsource it. I think under CDM you can, but I don't think you can the building regulations. That's my interpretation of it. So I think as a lead designer, you need to get on board with it and do things properly.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Well, just one last comment here from Ryan, which kind of is a summing up kind of comment. He's talking about he genuinely believes all of this will come down to good practice, standards, well-documented processes, and clear, concise appointments and scope, and ultimately case law as well, which I think we probably all agree with that. That's going to be helpful when some poor soul finds themselves in court on the wrong end of a case about all of this. It'll help develop the guidance, won't it, and the case law that we'll rely on. So
yeah, exactly. And Ryan, I'm not avoiding your questions. I'd lost them because there was that many that came through.
Yeah.
But you were kind of asking about default positions and things like that. So the default position for the PD, it does depend on, as we were saying, the domestic clients versus commercial clients. If it's a commercial client, and they haven't appointed, then they take on the duties of appointing. So you can be automatically the PD. If you don't have it in your scope of services, that you will not be doing the PD role. So if you don't stipulate that you're not doing that role, and it's all agreed in writing, and clients accepted your appointment letter, then yeah, you will become default principal designer. So that's why we've got those different template letters there for the different situations on which you find yourself. Because if you're not competent to be a principal designer, because it is quite a big responsibility, you've got to collate all of that evidence and make sure that it's all correctly lined up, and that it stands up against scrutiny. Then that's where you would say that, and so that's where you would avoid the default PD position. But then they would have to employ a principal designer, which probably would mean that you aren't in the running for the design job either. So I think that, you need to think carefully about it, and any way that you can upskill yourselves in terms of the principal designer role, whether that's going to you could go to the BS 8671, or you could go to the competences that we've got set out on our principal designer registration page on the CIAT website, and things like that, and I'm sure FMB will have theirs very soon or whatever. So, it's looking at the competencies really, and just kind of satisfying yourself that you can do those bits, bringing those bits to the fore to be able to kind of demonstrate to anybody that you can do that, in which case then you would probably apply for the register.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think we'll have to wrap things up now, because it's very nearly an hour that we've been going. That's been a really interesting discussion. I think I want to watch it back to get, there's a lot of content in there, isn't there? A lot of issues to pull out from that. My 3 key takeaways are: document everything, keep the communication channels open, and don't take on anything that you're not competent to actually do. So that's what I've taken away, but I think there was more within that. And sorry if we didn't get to your question, but there were a lot of questions that all came in at once. It was quite hard to keep on top of them. So Sarah, did you want to just say
Yeah,
anything?
just one final key point that that we haven't mentioned actually. So if the client doesn't agree or doesn't acknowledge that they understand their duties, you must not start work on their project. Same goes for the principal contractor. So if the client doesn't agree your appointment, doesn't agree that they understand their client responsibilities and client duties, then you must not start any work for them.
Right. I wonder how often that is happening actually in reality on sites.
Exactly.
Yeah, leave that question hanging in the air. That's great. Thank you, Peter, Nathan, Sarah, for your input into this webinar. And thank you for all of the members of CIAT and FMB who've attended today, and for your questions. It's been really interesting, and I think probably the start of a working partnership that we can continue to develop in the future. So watch this space, and we'll send you the follow-up email. If you've got any feedback, comments, or anything else you'd like to know about, please let us know, because we're really happy to get members' feedback. And yeah, thank you very much for attending, and goodbye.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. You guys still around?
You've still got 46 other participants in there.
Yep. How many people turned up? I'm just like interested in the numbers.
They're still there listening, aren't they? Or are they? Oh no, they've gone now. Have they gone? No, they're still in there.
Still.
That's fine. I haven't got anything to hide. I'm just intrigued in the numbers.
I think Hayley said there's about 130 odd that signed up for it. So and plus there'll be a lot that will watch again, I should imagine.
Yeah. They'll turn up. It's good turnout. Yeah.
Pretty good, yeah.
Good stuff.
We're staying on to listen now.
All right, yeah. Well done, guys. Really nice to do it with you as well.
Yeah, that's good. I'll agree. I think I like to say keep talking. All right. Cheers.
Yeah,
it's good. Thank you for everybody that turned up as well.
Yeah,
See you later.
Guys.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.